If you had to, how would you summarize your life in one sentence?
When I read that question before, I think it's hard to
Of course.
summarize my life. I've lived many lives, I've had many jobs, many lives, different countries, different places that I've lived in. It's hard to summarize it all in one thing, and who knows, I mean, how it ends, right? Or how much am I able to achieve before it ends. So yeah, it'll all depend on, what I leave behind, what purpose I serve before I go. So we'll see. It's an incomplete sentence, I guess.
Well, it's a sentence, and I think it says something. It also, I think, reflects a little bit about some questions I have about the nature of photography and these, expressions of single images to describe life, etc. But My Viewfinder is a proud member of the Alberta Podcast Network, locally grown, community supported. This episode of My Viewfinder is brought to you by our friends at TELUS Story Hive. Since 2013, TELUS Story Hive has funded productions and supported emerging filmmakers with mentorship and guidance from the National Screen Institute. The Story Hive program has brought hundreds of films to life from creators in Western Canada. Story Hive is committed to supporting underrepresented filmmakers and stories, which is why we want you to jump on this opportunity. Story Hive's documentary edition is back, and this one is all about local heroes. They're looking for documentary pitches from Alberta residents that highlight extraordinary citizens in your community, big or small. Successful pitches will receive $20,000 and customized mentorship to produce their project. Applications are open until October 7th at 1 p.m. Mountain Time. For eligibility requirements and to apply now, head to storyhive.com. As part of the inaugural Exposure Studio event, I had the opportunity to meet a wide variety of artists here in Calgary. While I don't necessarily want to keep my focus here, I have to start seeding these concepts somewhere, and where better than in our own backyard. Interestingly, my guest today is a woman from outside of the city. In fact, a woman who has touched soil around the world and brings this worldview to us. She has been developing a voice through her work, but in particular, in our conversation, I was inspired to keep in mind that we live in small boxes, and the path to spiritual growth exists outside of those boxes. Going out and interacting with people out there is how we can keep evolving in here. I'm not sure if this makes any sense anymore, but let's just get to the talk and see what your opinion is. Here's my chat with Twinkle Banerjee, photographer and all-around awesome person. Perhaps, if we could start, where you come from and how you found photography, and then, I don't know, give me an idea of some of these evolutions that have taken place and all of these worldviews that are bringing you here to who you are today.
Yeah, I grew up in India and grew up mostly with my maternal family. So I grew up with my grandparents and my uncle, and my uncle had a job that was constantly making him move. He used to work for the government, constantly moving from one place to another, sometimes in just 2 months, sometimes in 6 months. So even within India, I had the advantage of getting to see different states. We call them states there, not provinces, but getting to see different states, getting to see different culture growing up. So I never really felt like I belonged to any single place in India. It was funny, people would, even in India, people would say, "Where are you originally from?" And I would always say, "Well, I'm from here, but I lived all over." It was always that. And it didn't change much when I moved to Canada as well. But yeah, so there was, I was constantly traveling, from the very beginning of my life. And in those days, there was no Facebook or anything. So, it was very hard to forge connections that stayed with you for a long time. You were just traveling, you lost connection. It was very heartbreaking as a child. But, I think growing up, then I learned to just, constantly travel. And I loved just being, part of different cultures, learning different things. I could never sit in one place for too long. I never liked being in one place for too long. It just made me very agitated and insecure. And so, yeah, that is how things happened. And then eventually, obviously I moved to Canada And I've been here for 10 years now. Majority of it has been spent in Calgary.
So going through this, I think it's fascinating the idea of being. I think not that I've been to India, but the scale of
Mm-hmm.
Asia and what that might mean. It's not like here where you drive 5 hours to see another human being.
Mm-hmm.
And so the other thing I think that's often lost with China and India is that they're not necessarily homogenous peoples because, as you call them, states. There's so many cultures and languages that are alive within these countries. It's an amazing starting point, I think. Although moving around has its disadvantages, I guess, too socially. But
Yeah, but you learn a lot. You learn to assimilate in different cultures very quickly. You learn languages, you learn people skills, and especially if you're doing that at a very young age, you kind of learn those things very early on. How do you fit in? If you're going from one school to another school, how quickly can you get in and assimilate between different people? You learn different languages, so you automatically have this handle in society. You're speaking language, and because you're so young, you learn language at an age where you speak it just like the local people, right? You might get made fun of for the first 2 weeks because you're rolling your R a little different, but you're picking it up quickly. You're picking the accent, the local accents quickly. So yeah, you learn a lot of. I mean, I wouldn't have it any other way. It was painful when it did. I never learned how people just live in one place for all of their life. Like I just don't get it. Uh, but when it happened, it was painful. But I am very thankful for it. It has helped me now when I travel or anything like to. I just don't. I mean, I'm never scared when I'm traveling. I could be in any country. I wouldn't know any ABCD of the language, and I would be fine because in India, I had to even do my degree in South India and Tamil Nadu. And I like that language is utterly different from Hindi. It's a completely different language, completely different culture from where I spend majority of my life. My life in majority of my life was in North India. And I'm from Bengal, which is East India, but I went to study in Chennai, which is utter south, and the language, the culture, everything is different. So yeah, like just being there at a young age, not knowing the language, and then having to not only graduate, but I also worked there. Um, so, I mean, I'm so used to now going to any place. And if you put me and I don't understand the language, I'll be like, well, that's fine because I did it when I was 16. I can do it much better now. So, yeah, the scope of India, yeah, I mean, that's also where a lot of my frustration lies, I guess, that living here, how do you explain it to somebody? A lot of the time, if I say I'm from India, and this is a running joke between me and my other Indian friend, is that the moment you say you're from India, the two things people will say, oh, you're from India, I love butter chicken, or they'll say, oh yeah, I've watched Slumdog Millionaire. I would, I would want to go there, but I also don't want to deal with poverty. Those are the only two things that come out of people's mouths, and it's like, well, thank you for reducing my, thousands of year old civilization and culture and a subcontinent into a single dish of butter chicken. But there's the scope is insane. I mean, when we live in India, we look at each state as a different country. It's more diverse than obviously Europe is and bigger than Europe. But yeah, each state has the language, and it's insanity. I mean, to uh, the interracism that we have, you know, or the languages and the culture, like it's so different to navigate through them. And a lot of Indians, they themselves have not traveled all of the breadth of the continent. Right now, it's becoming a big thing among youngsters. They're traveling quite a bit. But when I was growing up, it wasn't a big thing. Especially if you were a woman, you weren't traveling that much within India. So a lot of the time, I mean, people just didn't know the other culture as much because they didn't even, they never went there. But now there's been a trend where people are, starting to travel a lot more, which is good. But yeah, you have to be there to know it, and you have to essentially at least spend a year and a half there traveling to even, scratch the surface to even understand the wide range of offering that is there.
it's one of those things that I've noticed too when I travel. You get this sense, yeah, that you can't even exactly scratch the surface at all when you're there for a few days, a week or two. So, how does photography enter your life here? Is it something that's been a part of this whole growing up process, or does it come in after you're working? Where does the camera start into your life?
Yeah, it's funny. Growing up, my family never had a camera. There was always a story with the camera. Either it got lost or, it didn't work. And I remember we would go on all these trips and my granddad would, we'll bring a camera. Let's say we would, bring it from somewhere. We would, borrow it from somebody or our own camera. And assure you, like there was always some issue with it and it wouldn't work. And we had such bad luck with photos. We'll go for these trips to the mountain or whatever, and we'll come back with no photo. So there was always this frustration with my family. I think they're all given up on photography, and anyway, so eventually when I grew up and I moved to Canada, but before moving to Canada, I was working, a weird job. I was in a ship, but I had a friend, and at that time I wasn't dating him, but I had a friend, and he had taken so many photos throughout the years. He was a good photographer, and most of his photography was in travel. And I, every time I would see his photos, it just brought me so much joy. Like I would just look at his photos and feel like I was in that place in that moment. He was able to do that really well. So, seeing his work always brought me so much joy, and that kind of motivated me initially, I would say. And I also wanted to get a camera and do travel photos like that. So when I moved to Canada eventually, I had a point and shoot before that, but then I bought a DSLR camera. And I was the crappiest photographer you can find. Just putting things on auto mode. I had no idea of where to go to learn. The DSLR camera that I bought was very intimidating. So I was just a very, very amateur photographer, and I would just put it on auto and just go out and start taking photos in Calgary. So that's how it started. It definitely helped me some days cope with, the loneliness of being in Canada and very new to Canada. It definitely helped me with that. But, it was funny because the day I brought my camera, all my traveling stopped. And I had brought it for, traveling, for taking travel photos. But it was funny. The day I brought it, I was stuck in Canada going through my immigration process, and I wasn't traveling at all. So it was just lying there, and I honestly did not use it that much. Like I said, it was for a very, amateur kind of a photography situation. So it just lied there for years. I mean, I bought my first DSLR camera in 2012, and honestly, I was just not taking any photos until I got my residency and I was able to travel again. And then, yeah, eventually, as I started traveling, I would take my camera with me, take photos, come back. But again, throughout all of this time, it was always auto mode and just taking digital photos, coming back, looking at them. I was getting better, but nothing, nothing outrageously good. Not that I'm any good today, but it wasn't where I wanted it to be. It was just very automatic. I was just pressing kind of the shutter button. There was no work. I wasn't putting anything to it. And then this, happened for a few years until 2-3 years ago when I said, enough is enough. Like the camera was super heavy. I was done with it. So I decided to sell the camera. And during this time, I'd also brought a Pentax, analog camera from eBay because I wanted to do film for the longest time. I've always been a fan of black and white more than color growing up. So I wanted to, just do true black and white and just go back to analog. So I bought my Pentax camera, sold my DSLR, said goodbye to it. And then for the last 2-3 years, I only did analog, and that helped me learn a lot, at least the process of it, the technicalities of things. It helped me learn. I told myself I'm going to finally put time into learning photography properly. So I shut off everything. I shut off Flickr. I shut off any digital, noise. Because you do get motivated, even if you don't want to. It does impact you in some way or the other, and you start to kind of sometimes make what you see. And I didn't want to be impacted by that, so I completely cut off everything. And then, basically the idea was to go to the library and pick whatever photography book I could find and just read like 2 books a week. Watch more videos. And I think the pivotal moment in my life was when I started looking at photography differently was that one day, I think New York Times, published an article, or I don't know which company, but they published an article of Harry Guer's, work, on Soviet Union. he had done this color work. His book was coming out, I believe, and just going through that article and seeing his work on color and on, how, he could push the limitations of camera to speak a different language. I think that was just, very, it was an epiphany for me at that moment. And so, I started looking at photography differently. It told me that there were other ways of doing it. I was just seeing very, very popularized shots on, Instagram or Flickr or whatever there was at the time. But, just looking at Harry Gould's work, I think that, I don't know if I'm saying his last name right, but that made me realize that, there was this other world out there. And then obviously from there, I got into Magnum and I started looking at Alex Webb's work. And so, things like that definitely challenge your notion. It's almost like you've known all this and now, there's this other world out there. So yeah, I started focusing on people that I really loved, their color work, and then obviously doing my black and white side by side. And then, yeah, that's how, the whole learning process changed. And that's when I started taking photography seriously. And I wanted to do that kind of work, So I think, yeah, it has definitely evolved, but I'm still in a transition because because of analog, my approach definitely had slowed down quite a bit. Once I moved to analog, I was doing things much slowly, between film and resource and how much money you have to spend and, getting it developed and scanning, that is another pain. And so doing all of that just slowed it down. And it helped me kind of look at photography differently rather than, doing 20,000 shots. I was taking maybe very few, but focusing on that one shot. So brought in more meditative sort of an approach to photography. But yeah, so, all of that got together. And so, yeah, it slowed it down. It helped me learn things, technical things a lot better. And then, recently now I've switched back to digital, which is helping me make more projects much quicker because it's digital. I don't have to worry about film and scanning and all that. So yeah, finally I moved back to digital, but again, keeping film, as well on the side.
The word that comes to mind listening to you is intentionality. I mean, the idea that when you make, your history growing up, studying different languages, assimilating into cultures, there's that going and studying, your final thing is starting work in southern India, you said is a completely different language. To be able to survive in that environment is fascinating. And then, when you make the decision to learn the camera, like reading 2 books a week, finding inspiring work, and then of course, I don't shoot analog, but the intentionality of, never mind the cost, even just having, 30 whatever it is frames to work with. Yeah, it just changes the sense of the moment. I think it's fascinating when I speak with friends who shoot film when they're not being too puritanical about it. They approach the craft in a very intentional, technical, and immersed way. It's great to hear. I think it's fascinating the different approaches people have to getting into this craft. So, with that in mind, we've met through the Exposure Studio project. But one of the themes that seems to come up a lot is this idea of bias. And this, you brought up your friend, I think you said you were working on a ship, like a ship, yes?
Yeah, I was working on it wasn't a cruise ship, but a residential ship, yeah, where people lived.
That's fascinating. If we have time, we'll come back and you can teach me what a residential ship is. But do you have an idea of this role that the camera and photography play in bias and culture?
When we talk about bias, I have thought about it a lot, actually, and something that sometimes actually makes me angry. You'll get a lot of anger when I talk, but it sometimes it can be frustrating. I can speak for myself, looking at my own background. I think growing up in India, I love Steve McCrae's work, and obviously there were other big players in the industry that had gone to India and taken photos, from Henri Cartier-Bresson to Steve McCrae and everybody else in between. But what happened was, obviously India was going through a horrible time after the British left, after the independence. it was left with, no constitution, no structure, nothing. And overnight things changed. There were, I mean, there was obviously famine when Churchill was responsible for it. Like there was a huge famine before that, but there were famines happening. India was going through division. There was India Pakistan that got divided in the 1970s. Bangladesh, which was East Pakistan at the time, that again had a war with India, and there was mass migration of people. And there were obviously amazing photographers that went to India and did that kind of work. And eventually, Steve McCrae came and he did amazing color work in India as well. But what later on that led to, and I'm nobody to say this because, I mean, they're great masters, but I think what eventually led to was that people thought of India in a very certain way. And, it's funny because when those photos were taken, the condition in India was like that, and they were kind of reflecting on the time. But eventually what that led to was this very, set notion about India. It was either very colorful or, very exotic or, very impoverished. There were all these notions that got set up about India. And that led to even Indians who were taking photos of that and kind of confirming that notion as well over and over, because that was the thing to do. That became the new trend. And so, when I was kind of getting into photography, or even before that, just going to National Geographic magazines or anything else, you would constantly come across these photos that confirm that notion. And it kind of, got a little bit frustrating. I mean, I don't want to hide the issues that India has, but there is a way to tell a story rather than just looking at, this is how it is. Those are, again, bigger conversations. I'm sure it cannot be, dealt with in an hour, but, there has to be a maturity in telling a story. And if it's just a picture with no background, why things are that way, I don't think it paints the right picture. I don't think it gives people the in-depth understanding of the situation. And, I might be blabbering through this because I haven't thought this through myself, but, recently, I've seen there's a new kind of a trend where, there was that very colorful exoticism of India, or very, a lot of poverty of India. And now there's this like, photos that I see in Vogue Italia, the thing that they do, the forum that they have. I almost know before somebody even posts that photo that will get selected, because it is, again, a different kind of an exoticism. I don't know what that is, but you can almost tell like that's the new trend now. And, if there is a woman in sari in a specific way, those photos will get picked up very quickly. And I feel like between these two extremes, what has gotten lost is the story of just regular people. I've always said this to my other friends, it can be very frustrating when you go to Hollywood and the only movies that you see of India are magic realism, whether it's Life of Pi or, Mistress of Spices, like everything is about magic realism. And it's like, okay, well, India has spiritualism and, yoga and all that came from India, but people are very, pragmatic there. Like people deal with their day-to-day lives very normally, just like anybody else would. And nobody is, talking about those stories, even in photography. And I think, that can, I think that bias has, always bothered me. And recently it has started to bother me even more because I'm seeing this new trend. But yeah, I mean, as I have gotten mature in my own photography, I think it's become important to tell all sides of the story. Obviously, when I was doing travel photography, it was just, showing the best of that country. But even with traveling alone, it has changed too. Like my perspective of, when I go to a country, I just don't want to see, all the touristy places and all the good stuff. I want to see everything that it comes with. So I think, yeah, reflecting, in my own work, I haven't done any serious work so far. But, if I was to go back to India and tell some stories, I do want to try my best to, bring in justice instead of making it look, either too sad or too happy. Like there's always that medium and balance that we have to look for. It's, easier said than done. But yeah, I mean, you always have to be consciously aware of the story you're trying to tell and, trying to do it justice without a bias. But yeah, I think, I haven't gone to that point where, I've gone back and created good work. But when I do, hopefully, who knows?
Well, I mean, I've just been introduced to you through this thing, and I just found your feed. But I do love your photography. I think this idea of phrasing it in a sort of self-critical way is also dangerous. The thing for me about bias is there's also this pull within each of us, that we're supposed to be doing something maybe very broad, very like impactful that might help change the world. Um, and I'm also caught on that. I mean, there's a part of me, I've been in addiction recovery. I've been around this thing. I have this identity crisis. Being I was born in Toronto, but my parents are Korean, and as you describe, the historical setting of where India was and where it is now. I've just been, I mean, I've known about it. I've just been researching the true, I suppose, data, at least as it's been presented to world history about the Korean War that my parents grew up in. And yeah, it's fascinating to think about. I don't know them at all, or their experiences, etc. But I also don't know what it's like to be, a generational white Canadian person, despite being a Canadian person. So those things are always going to influence and give us tension, I think. And it's a hard thing to know what you're supposed to do next.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and unless you are there, I mean, that's my thing. Ideally the goal would be to go back and do some good work. India is fascinating in a way that right now a lot of the things that were commonplace even when I was growing up or 10, 15 years ago are kind of disappearing now. A lot of the art and culture that exist in folk, communities or indigenous communities, it's disappearing very, very rapidly. And when we talk about climate change overall, we're thinking about the Arctic and everything else, and the weather patterns. But even culture, I mean, it can be impacted hugely. I've started looking into researching this recently, and I was talking about Sundarban, which is the delta of the Ganges, and Sundarban had a huge indigenous population. But it was in the Ganges Delta. So as with climate change, rising sea levels, flash floods, they're kind of part of their land that they used to own to do agriculture is also kind of washing away slowly. And because of other climatic extreme situations, they're not able to grow as much as they could before. And their life has always been hard because of cyclones or whatever, because of the location that they're in. But I recently found out that a lot of these people actually migrate to cities like Delhi, the capital of India, like New Delhi and stuff, and they take like day jobs, really the jobs that nobody else wants to do, whether it's cleaning a sewage, manhole, or working in somebody's house as a daily, as a servant or help. And I mean, can you imagine the culture that is now shifting? Like all these people that are now becoming daily wage earners, they are leaving that culture behind. They're not taking it with them because they're there to work and make money. And so when you think of the impact of overall, climate, you are also thinking of, diminishing cultures and things like that. So, ideally my idea is to go back to India and, just kind of document that life that is kind of diminishing each day, or the way of life, or the different little, traditions and things we had growing up that might not exist because of, severe westernization, and because of, obviously internet and digital media. I mean, when I went to India last year and a half ago, it was after 4 years. And before that, it was, only once in the last 10 years. And I mean, I saw very rapid change in India. It's a good thing. I think, in a way, internet has given everybody the same platform to learn and to, explore their creativity, which is great. But, it's globalization in a very different scale. It's happening very, very quickly. And so you had people, you had circuses in the villages. You would have this massive scale circuses that would go around India that I don't know if it'll exist in another 10 years or so or not. You had these street performances. I don't know if that will exist anymore or not. I have seen several interviews with people where these are artists in villages that make, let's say clay pottery or certain kind of pottery or dolls, or, they tell stories through writing writing poems on leaves, things that seem so ancient, but it happened, until now. But I don't know if it will exist for a very long time, because again, these people are also finding it very hard to survive in the villages because of, massive drought or heat. They are moving to, they're trying to save up whatever money they can to teach their children so the children can move to the cities and get a job. There's sometimes mass migration happening from smaller towns to cities. So, there's a lot of culture. We are in a very, how do I call it? We're in a transitional point in India. A lot of things might not exist in the next 10 to 15 years. So I think it's a good opportunity now to just go and kind of document that quickly before, that happens. And I think that's overall, that would be ideal to go back and tell those stories and document those stories. But we'll see how quickly I can do that, how quickly I can quit my job and go back.
This episode was brought to you by the Calgary Foundation. Whether it's funding anti-racism programs, addiction recovery, or food hampers for the hungry, for 65 years, the Calgary Foundation has proudly supported the charitable community to address some of Calgary's biggest challenges. Now, during this period of unprecedented urgent needs, Calgary Foundation renewed its commitment to building a healthy, vibrant, giving, caring, and resilient community. If you're a registered charity looking for a grant, a professional advisor creating a giving plan for your client, or a donor wanting to give back to community, discover a wealth of resources at calgaryfoundation.org and learn more about their work through Calgary Foundation's Facebook